When I first laid eyes on the house, it looked like the perfect place to start fresh. My last apartment had been cramped, noisy, and above all, suffocating. The move wasn't driven by any major life change. I wasn't running from a breakup or looking to find myself in a new town. I just wanted a change of scenery, something quieter, more peaceful. And the town of Ashfield, nestled on the edge of a thick forest, seemed ideal. The house itself was simple. A small two-story building with white siding, a wraparound porch, and a garden in the back that had long since been overtaken by weeds. It had been sitting vacant for a while, according to the real estate agent. People prefer to live closer to the city, she had said with a shrug when I asked why it was so affordable. I didn't mind. The quiet was what I was looking for. The first few days were normal enough. Moving boxes, arranging furniture, getting used to the creaks and groans of an old house. Ashfield was even quieter than I had expected. My nearest neighbor was a few hundred yards away, and I rarely saw anyone outside. The town had one small grocery store, a gas station, and a cafe, and not much else. People kept to themselves. That suited me just fine. It wasn't until my second week there that I started noticing it. At first, it was just a vague, gnawing feeling, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I would go out to get groceries or grab a coffee, and I'd realize, after the fact, that something felt off. I'd glance around the store or cafe and realize that everyone around me was a man. The barista, the cashier, the customers. All men. It struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to coincidence. Small towns are quirky, right? I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just reading too much into things. After all, what could it possibly mean? But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing. Everywhere I went, it was the same. At the gas station, the town hall, even the post office. It was always men. No women, no kids. Just men, all of them going about their lives as if everything was perfectly normal. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The air was cool, the leaves rustling in the trees. I walked through the quiet streets, my footsteps echoing in the empty silence. As I passed the houses, I started paying attention to the people I saw. A man working in his yard, another man sitting on his porch, two men talking on the sidewalk. It was like someone had taken a normal town and filtered out half the population. I stopped at a park near the center of town. It was small, with a few benches and a playground that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a group of men sitting on one of the benches, talking quietly amongst themselves. I walked closer, pretending to be looking at my phone, and tried to catch bits of their conversation. Their voices were low, and I could only pick up fragments. Still no sign. Don't ask questions. Better off not knowing. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't sure if they were talking about me or something else, but the way they glanced around nervously told me it was something they weren't supposed to be discussing in public. I quickly turned and walked back home, my heart pounding in my chest. The unease I had been feeling since I moved here had grown into full-blown paranoia. What was going on in this town? Why hadn't I noticed this before? More importantly, why wasn't anyone else concerned? That night, as I sat in my living room trying to relax, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. It was late, too late for someone to be knocking. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. I hadn't made any friends here. Who could possibly be visiting me at this hour? I approached the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, his face obscured by the dim porch light. He knocked again, more insistently this time. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Just a neighbor," the man replied. Wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about his voice put me on edge. It was too calm, too rehearsed, like he had said it 100 times before. But I couldn't just ignore him, right? That would be rude. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I was just being paranoid after all. I opened the door a crack, enough to see his face. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and a friendly smile. He didn't seem threatening, but there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping the door halfway closed. He smiled wider, but his eyes didn't match. "Just thought I'd come by, see how you're settling in." "I'm fine, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just getting used to the place." "Good, good," he said, his smile never faltering. "It's a good town. Quiet. Safe." There was a pause, a moment of uncomfortable silence as he stared at me. Then his smile faded slightly. "You'll get used to it. Don't worry too much about the peculiarities around here." I blinked, caught off guard. Peculiarities. His smile returned, wider than before. "Just small-town stuff. You'll understand soon enough." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty porch, my mind spinning. Something was very wrong in Ashfield, and I had the sinking feeling that I was about to find out exactly what. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie stillness that had settled over the house. The quiet had always been something I liked about Ashfield, but now it felt different, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the conversation from the night before or the strange encounter with the man on my porch. His words echoed in my head. "You'll get used to it." I went through my usual morning routine, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was overreacting. But when I stepped outside to check the mailbox, I felt it again, that creeping unease. The air was too still, the streets too empty. There were no cars driving by, no distant hum of conversation, just an unnatural hush hanging over the neighborhood. I walked down the driveway, glancing up and down the street. It was deserted. The same men I had seen working in their yards or sitting on their porches were nowhere to be found. It was like the entire town had gone underground overnight. When I got to the mailbox, I found nothing but a single white envelope. No return address, no postage. Just my name scrawled on the front in messy handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, my pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, cryptic message. Asterisk, don't ask questions. Trust no one. Leave asterisk. My hands trembled as I read the words over and over. Who had sent this? And what exactly was I supposed to do with it? The part of me that still wanted to believe everything was normal tried to brush it off as some kind of prank. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I stuffed the note into my pocket and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. I tried to focus, to think rationally. Maybe it was just some local kids messing with the new guy. Or maybe I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to. That afternoon, I decided to head into town, partly to distract myself and partly to see if I could figure out what the hell was going on. I took a different route, walking through a few side streets I hadn't explored before. The houses there were older, more run down, as if this part of town had been forgotten. As I walked, I noticed something strange. All the houses had curtains drawn over the windows, tightly shut like they were deliberately hiding something. And, once again, there was no one in sight. I passed a small hardware store and decided to pop in, hoping the normalcy of running an errand would calm my nerves. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and a man at the counter looked up. He was in his early 40s, with dark circles under his eyes and a deep frown. "Help you with something?" he asked, his voice flat. I tried to smile, though it felt forced. "Just looking around, thanks." He nodded and went back to whatever he was doing, barely acknowledging my presence. I wandered through the aisles, pretending to browse, but my mind wasn't really on the shelves in front of me. I was too busy watching him from the corner of my eye. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he avoided making eye contact. It was the same feeling I'd gotten from the man on my porch. These people were hiding something. After a few minutes, I brought a pack of light bulbs up to the counter, just for the sake of making conversation. "Quiet town, huh?" I said as he rang me up. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, quiet." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my tone casual. "I've noticed, there aren't many women around here." For a split second, his hand froze over the register. Then he quickly finished the transaction, not meeting my gaze. "Small town," he muttered, pushing the bag toward me. "People come and go." I didn't press further, sensing that I wasn't going to get any more answers from him. But as I turned to leave, he cleared his throat. I looked back, and he was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Be careful," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things you don't want to know." I nodded, too unnerved to respond, and hurried out of the store. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been warned off, though from what, I had no idea. By the time I got back home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. I kept expecting to see someone, anyone, outside, but the town was still eerily empty. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. I locked the door behind me, my mind racing. I couldn't be imagining all of this. Could I? The lack of women, the cryptic warning, the strange behavior of the townspeople. It was all adding up to something, but I didn't have enough pieces of the puzzle to make sense of it yet. I decided to do some research. Maybe I could find out if Ashfield had some kind of strange history, something that would explain the unsettling vibe of the place. I pulled out my laptop and started digging through online articles and forums, but there wasn't much to find. Ashfield was a blip on the map, barely mentioned in any official records. It was like the town didn't really exist. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I stumbled across an old newspaper article from a neighboring town. The headline caught my eye. "Ashfield residents report strange disappearances. No women reported missing, officials say." The article was from decades ago, but it sent a chill down my spine. It detailed a series of mysterious disappearances in Ashfield, all of them women. According to the article, the local police had investigated but found no evidence of foul play. The disappearances had been chalked up to people moving away or leaving without notice. The official line was that there was nothing unusual about it. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The article included a picture of the town council at the time, a group of men standing in front of the town hall, all with the same unsettling smiles. One of them was the man who had knocked on my door the night before. I closed the laptop, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence. Something was happening in Ashfield, something that had been happening for a long time, and I was right in the middle of it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept hearing the creaks and groans of the old house, each one setting my nerves on edge. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that man's face. The forced smile, the way his eyes had stayed cold and dead, even when his lips curled upward. It haunted me. By morning, I was exhausted, but my mind was clearer. If I was going to figure out what was going on in this town, I needed answers. Real answers. The newspaper article had given me a lead, but it wasn't enough. I needed to talk to someone who had been in Ashfield long enough to know the town's history. Someone who might actually tell me the truth. There was only one place I could think of. The library. I hadn't been inside since I moved, but I remembered seeing it on my first drive through town. A squat, brick building near the town square. It seemed like the kind of place that wouldn't get many visitors, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for attention. The library was as quiet as I expected when I arrived. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, rows of dusty bookshelves stretched out in every direction, their contents barely touched. Behind the counter, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses sat reading a book, barely glancing up when I entered. I approached the counter, clearing my throat to get his attention. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I'm looking for information on the town. Do you have any old records? Newspapers, anything like that?" The man peered at me over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just studied me with a faint frown, as if he were weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, he closed the book with a soft thud and stood up. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated. I couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. "I'm just curious about the history of the place. I moved here recently and thought I'd learn a bit more about the town." He eyed me suspiciously for another moment before nodding slowly. "Follow me." He led me toward the back of the library, where the shelves became even more neglected, covered in a fine layer of dust. At the far end of the room, he stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. As the door creaked open, a musty smell wafted out, and I realized this was where they kept the older archives. "Most of the town records are here," he said, flicking on a dim light that barely illuminated the room. "If you're looking for something specific, it might take some time." I nodded, stepping inside. "Thanks. I'll be careful." He gave me one last, long look before turning and walking away, the door closing softly behind him. I was alone. The room was small, lined with filing cabinets and stacks of old newspapers and documents, many of them yellowed with age. I started sifting through them, not sure what I was hoping to find. The town's records were sparse, mostly mundane things like property sales, local elections, and zoning changes. Nothing that hinted at anything sinister. But then, as I flipped through an old newspaper from the 1980s, I found something that made me stop cold. It was another article about disappearances. This one was older, much older, but it was nearly identical to the one I had found online. The same vague language, the same lack of any real investigation. The women who had disappeared were simply listed as missing, with no further details or follow-up reports. As I dug deeper, I found more. Articles from the 1960s, 1950s, even as far back as the 1920s. Every few decades, there would be a rash of disappearances, always women, always the same excuses from the authorities. No foul play, no evidence. The women had just left, moved away, and the town went on as if nothing had happened. I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach as the realization set in. This had been happening for nearly a century, maybe longer. The town was erasing its women, one by one, and no one seemed to care. Or worse, they were complicit. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I needed more than this. I needed to know why. Why only women? Why had no one outside of Ashfield noticed? And most importantly, why had I moved here in the first place? Was this random or had I been chosen? Before I could spiral further, I noticed something. A faint scratching sound, like the scraping of nails on wood, coming from somewhere in the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it was getting closer. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. It was dim, the light barely reaching the far corners, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, moving unnaturally. The sound grew louder, coming from the far wall where the filing cabinets stood in a row. I took a step forward, my hands shaking. The noise was now accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thumping, as if something or someone was trapped behind the wall. I hesitated, then walked over to the filing cabinets. The sound was definitely coming from behind them. I pulled one of the drawers open, but all I found were old town ledgers and tax records. I tried the next cabinet, then the next, but it was the same, just useless paperwork. Yet the noise continued, growing more insistent with each passing second. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the librarian to appear, but there was no one. I was completely alone. Swallowing my fear, I knelt down and began feeling along the bottom of the cabinets. My fingers brushed something cold and metallic. A handle. My heart pounded as I gripped the handle and tugged. To my shock, the entire filing cabinet shifted slightly, revealing a small, narrow door built into the wall. The thumping sound was louder now, almost frantic. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of that room and never look back. But I couldn't. Not now. I had come this far. I needed to know what was behind that door. With trembling hands, I turned the handle and pulled it open. The smell hit me first, an overpowering stench of damp earth and decay. I gagged, stepping back, but the sight that greeted me was worse than I could have imagined. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, and at the bottom, I could just make out the faint outline of a figure. Before I could react, the figure moved, stumbling forward into the dim light. It was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her skin pale and bruised, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out toward me, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please, help me." I staggered back, my mind reeling. How long had she been down there? How many more were trapped below? And who had put them there? Before I could think, I heard footsteps behind me, the sound of someone approaching the room. I spun around, my heart racing. The librarian was standing in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes cold. "I told you," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "Some things you don't want to know." The librarian's eyes were fixed on mine, as if daring me to move. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. The woman at the bottom of the staircase was still whimpering softly, her frail hand outstretched toward me. I couldn't make sense of any of it. The hidden door, the woman, the librarian's calmness in the face of something so horrific. "What is this?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "What the hell is going on here?" The librarian took a slow step forward, his face impassive. "You shouldn't have opened that door. You weren't supposed to see this." I backed up instinctively, my legs bumping into the edge of the filing cabinet. The woman's soft cries echoed up the stairs, and I glanced back at her. She looked gaunt, almost skeletal, her eyes filled with a desperate fear I could feel in my own bones. "You have to help her," I said, my voice rising with panic. She's trapped down there." The librarian sighed, almost as if he were dealing with a child. "You don't understand. This is how it has to be. It's for the good of the town." "For the good of the town?" I spat, incredulous. "You're keeping people locked down here. You're—" Before I could finish, he moved faster than I expected, grabbing my arm in a tight grip. His fingers dug painfully into my skin, and I gasped, trying to pull away. But his strength was surprising, and I realized with dawning horror that I was completely outmatched. "I warned you," he said quietly, his face inches from mine. "This town has rules. You can't change them. You should have stayed ignorant like the rest." I struggled, my mind racing for an escape. The room was small, and the only exit was blocked by the librarian. Behind me, the woman's weak cries grew fainter, and I felt a rush of guilt and helplessness. I couldn't leave her down there, not like this. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted violently, yanking my arm free from his grasp. He stumbled back, surprised, and I seized the opportunity. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the heavy metal drawers from the filing cabinet and slammed it into his side. He let out a grunt of pain, doubling over, and I darted past him toward the door. I had to get help, had to find someone, anyone who wasn't involved in this sick, twisted secret. But as I reached the door, the librarian's voice stopped me cold. "You think they'll help you?" he called out, his tone mocking. "They already know. They all know." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The weight of his words sank in like ice water. All of them? The neighbors, the men at the cafe, the cashier at the grocery store, were they all part of this? Was this why the town seemed so disturbingly perfect, so unnaturally quiet? I turned slowly, staring at him in disbelief. What are you talking about?" The librarian straightened up, wincing as he pressed a hand to his ribs where I had hit him. But his eyes were sharp, filled with a cold certainty that made my blood run cold. "This town has been here a long time," he said, his voice steady now. "Longer than you can imagine. It has rules, traditions, things that keep it safe." "Safe," I repeated, horrified. "You're talking about kidnapping and God knows what else. You call that safe?" He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. You can't. The town needs balance. A sacrifice, if you want to call it that. The women, they're part of that balance. Without it, the town would fall apart. Things would get much worse." I felt sick to my stomach. "You're insane." "No," he said calmly, stepping closer again. "I'm a protector. We all are." My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. A protector? A balance? It sounded like some kind of cult, but this was different. It wasn't just a group of fanatics. This entire town was built on a foundation of lies, a system that everyone knew about, but no one talked about. Everyone played their part, and the women, they were the ones who paid the price. I thought about the man who had come to my door, about his cryptic warning not to worry about the peculiarities of the town. It was starting to make sense now. He wasn't warning me to be careful. He was warning me to accept it, to keep my head down and not ask questions, to become part of the system. But I couldn't, not after what I had seen. "What happens to them?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian's eyes flicked toward the open door in the wall, where the staircase led down into the darkness. His expression didn't change. "They're kept, watched over, protected in a way." "Protected?" I snapped, You're keeping them in a basement like animals. It's better than the alternative, he said, his voice cold. If the balance is broken, if the rules aren't followed, worse things will come. Trust me, this is mercy. My mind whirled, trying to make sense of it all. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that none of it mattered. Whatever twisted logic they used to justify this, it didn't change the fact that these women were being taken against their will, hidden away and forgotten. And now I was part of it. Whether I liked it or not, I had seen too much. I'm leaving, I said finally, my voice firm. And I'm taking her with me. The librarian's eyes narrowed, his calm facade slipping for the first time. You can't. You'll never make it out. They won't let you. I don't care, I said, my resolve hardening. I'm not staying in this nightmare. Without waiting for a response, I turned and ran toward the staircase. The woman at the bottom was barely moving now, her strength fading. I didn't know how long she had been down here, but I wasn't about to leave her behind. I had to try. I rushed down the narrow steps, the air growing colder and more oppressive the deeper I went. The stench of decay clung to everything, making it hard to breathe. But I didn't stop. When I reached her, I knelt down and gently shook her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, and she stared up at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. I'm going to get you out of here, I whispered. Can you stand? She nodded weakly, though I could tell it was taking all of her strength just to stay conscious. I helped her to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. Together, we started up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But as we reached the top, I froze. The door was open, and standing there, blocking our only escape, was a group of men. Not just the librarian. There were 5 of them now, each one wearing the same expression of cold, unfeeling resolve. You can't leave, the librarian said softly, stepping forward. This is your home now, just like it's hers. Panic surged through me as I backed up, the woman leaning heavily on my shoulder. There was no way out. The narrow staircase was behind us, and the men in front of us showed no signs of backing down. We were trapped, and that's when I realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't just been keeping women in the basement. They had been collecting them. The men stood in the doorway like statues, blocking every chance of escape. The woman beside me trembled, her grip tightening on my arm as she struggled to stay upright. I could hear her shallow, panicked breaths, feel the weight of her fear, mirroring my own. There were 5 of them, each with the same unsettling calm in their eyes, the same cold indifference to the horror they were a part of. The librarian stood at the front, his hands clasped in front of him like some kind of priest overseeing a dark ritual. Behind him, the others seemed to be waiting for a signal, their faces hard, their muscles tense. You can't leave, the librarian repeated, his voice eerily calm. The town needs you now. You've seen too much. I knew there was no reasoning with him. No plea I could make that would change what was about to happen. They weren't just protecting a secret. They were protecting themselves, their twisted way of life. And I was a threat to that. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I scanned the room quickly, looking for anything I could use. The woman's weight pressed heavily against me, and I knew she didn't have the strength to run. If we were going to get out of here, I had to think fast. Behind the librarian, I spotted something. An old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, just out of their immediate reach. I glanced at the men again. They were too focused on me, too confident that they had us trapped. They hadn't noticed. Without a second thought, I made my move. I let go of the woman, setting her gently against the wall, and lunged toward the fire extinguisher. The librarian's eyes widened in surprise, and before he could react, I ripped it from its holder and sprayed it directly at them. A cloud of white foam exploded into the room, blinding them. The men shouted in confusion, stumbling backward as the cold mist enveloped them. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing the woman's hand, I pulled her toward the now cleared doorway, pushing through the chaos. "Run!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep up. But we had no choice. We sprinted through the library, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind us, I could hear the men cursing, their heavy footsteps closing in. But I didn't look back. Couldn't. All that mattered was getting out. Getting as far away from this cursed town as possible. Bursting through the front door, the cold night air hit us like a slap to the face. The streets were dark, eerily quiet, but I didn't stop. I half-carried, half-dragged the woman as we made our way toward my car, parked just down the street. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept me going. We reached the car just as the men spilled out of the library behind us, their silhouettes dark against the dim glow of the streetlights. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. I could feel them getting closer, could hear their heavy footsteps pounding the pavement. Finally, the door clicked open. I shoved the woman into the passenger seat and scrambled into the driver's side, slamming the door shut just as the men reached the car. One of them pounded on the window, his face twisted in anger. "Drive!" The woman gasped, her voice hoarse with terror. I didn't need to be told twice. I jammed the key into the ignition and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men stumbling back, their faces illuminated briefly in the headlights before disappearing into the darkness. We sped down the narrow, winding streets of Ashfield, the town blurring around us. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the library, away from the men, away from the nightmare that had consumed this place. The woman beside me was silent, her head resting against the window. She was barely conscious, her strength all but spent. I didn't dare speak, didn't dare ask any of the questions swirling in my mind. Not yet. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. As we drove, the town began to thin out, the houses growing farther apart, the trees pressing in on either side of the road. I didn't stop until we had left Ashfield far behind, the dark forest closing in around us like a protective shroud. Finally, after what felt like hours, I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a cold, hollow dread that settled deep in my chest. I turned to the woman. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond at first, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. But after a moment, she nodded weakly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You saved me." I shook my head, still struggling to comprehend everything that had happened. "Who are you? What is this place? Why were they keeping you down there?" Her eyes flickered open, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of something behind the fear. Something like hope. They call it the balance. The women were taken. Some of us disappear forever. The town. It needs us or something worse will happen. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This town, Ashfield, wasn't just a strange, isolated community. It was something far darker. Something that fed on sacrifice on the lives of innocent women like her. The men, the entire town, had been complicit in it for generations. But now Now I had broken that balance. I didn't know what that meant, what the consequences would be, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let that twisted cycle continue. "We need to go to the police," I said, already reaching for my phone. "We need to tell someone." She reached out, her hand weakly grasping mine. "No," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. The police, the town, they're all part of it. They'll never let us leave." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Then what do we do?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a haunted desperation. "We run, as far as we can, and we never look back." I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities, with the horrible realization that no matter where we went, Ashfield's shadow would follow us. But in that moment, I knew she was right. There was no going back. I started the car again, the engine rumbling to life, and together we drove into the night. Away from Ashfield, away from the horrors it hid, and into an uncertain future. But whatever came next, it couldn't be worse than what we'd left behind. As the road stretched out before us, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The town of Ashfield had disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees. But deep down I knew it wasn't gone. Not really, and it never would be.